7. I think it's better that we begin rather than keep waiting. I will sort of start by introducing Professor Mamdani. As we generically say, a man who needs no introduction, but those are the introductions that take the longest. So I will sort of quickly just say a few words that I researched so that I don't miss anything out. And then we will, Professor Mamdani will speak for 30 minutes, and then the discussants will take over, and then I'll open it up for everybody else in the audience. So with that, let us begin today's book discussion, which we've been looking forward to for some time. Professor Mahmood Mamdani currently serves as the Chancellor of Kampala International University, Uganda. He is the director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research, the MISR, the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, and the Professor of Anthropology, Political Science and African Studies at Columbia University. I will keep pausing as people keep as I keep admitting people. So forgive me if, you know, I'm not very fluid with all of this. Professor Mamdani received his PhD from Harvard University in 1974. He specializes, as I'm sure all of you know already, in the study of African history and politics. His works explore the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. He has received numerous awards and recognitions, including being listed as one of the top 20 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy in the US and Prospect magazine in the UK in 2008. From 1998 to 2002, he served as president of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa. His essays have appeared in the New Left Review and the London Review of Books, among other journals. His many books include Saviors and Survivors, Darfur Politics and the War on Terror, 2009, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror, 2004, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism and Genocide in Rwanda, 2001. So you can see that I'm going backward in time. Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, 1996, which was awarded the Herskovits Prize of the African Studies Association. Politics and Class Formation in Uganda, 76, From Citizen to Refugee, 73, and The Myth of Population Control, Family, Class and Caste in an Indian Village, 1972. That's the earliest book. His current work takes as its point of departure his 1996 book, Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Colonialism. He has two major interests. The first is the reproduction of political identities. Starting with a historical exploration of political identities enforced by the colonial state, his research looks at the reproduction of these through the definition of citizenship in the post-independence period. He frames these questions through empirical work in different African countries, for example, South Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, Nigeria, and North and South Sudan. His second interest is in the institutional reproduction of knowledge, particularly in what is called African studies. It is perhaps this interest that has led to him being awarded as principal investigator a 5-year, 5-institution grant awarded by the Mellon Foundation titled Decolonization, the Disciplines and the University, of which the CSSC is a proud partner. His latest book, the one we're here to discuss today, is called Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. And this makes the radical argument that the nation state was born of colonialism and asks us to rethink political violence and reimagine political community beyond majorities and minorities. In this genealogy of political modernity, he argues that the nation state and the colonial state created each other. In case after case around the globe, from the New World to South Africa, Israel to Germany to Sudan, the colonial state and the nation state have been mutually constructed through the politicization of a religious or ethnic majority at the expense of an equally manufactured minority. The model emerged in North America, he argues, where genocide and internment on reservations created both a permanent native underclass and the physical and ideological spaces in which new immigrant identities crystallized as a settler nation. In Europe, this template would be used by the Nazis to address the Jewish question, and after the fall of the Third Reich by the Allies, to redraw the boundaries of Eastern Europe's nation states, cleansing them of their minorities. After Nuremberg, the template was used to preserve the idea of the Jews as a separate nation. By establishing Israel through the minoritization of Palestinian Arabs, Zionist settlers followed the North American example. The result, he argues, has been another cycle of violence. Neither settler nor native offers a vision for arresting this historical process. Mamdani rejects the criminal solution attempted at Nuremberg, which held individual perpetrators responsible without questioning Nazism as a political project, and thus the violence of the nation state itself. Instead, political violence, he says, demands political solutions, not criminal justice for perpetrators, but a rethinking of the political community for all survivors, victims, perpetrators, bystanders, beneficiaries, based on common residence and the commitment to build a common future without the permanent political identities of settler and native. Mamdani points to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa as an unfinished project, seeking a state without a nation. Professor Mamdani will be speaking for 30 minutes, followed by 10 minutes each for our three discussants, all three of whom have a long-standing association with the CSSC. Thomas Blom Hansen, Professor, Department of Anthropology, Stanford University; Bodhisattva Kaur, Senior Lecturer, Department of Historical Studies, University of Cape Town; and Karthik Ram Manoharan, Research Fellow, University of Wolverhampton, after which the session will be open for audience questions. So welcome everybody, and I will now hand it over to Professor Mamdani, who will be speaking about his book for the next 30 minutes. Professor Mamdani.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaudhary. And thank you to my discussants. And thank you to those who have come to listen to this. This is a book about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a discussion of the two phases of nation state, non-liberal and liberal. The nation state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its borders, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Jews and Muslims. There followed a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The liberal solution to religious wars was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal solution was put forward in John Locke's treatise on tolerance. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority cannot participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original sin in the liberal theory of the nation state. Now, in this book, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. The distinction between religious groups was further developed into a civilizational difference between races and tribes. This development is explored in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. This is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, following the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in today's world. Now, in this talk, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I seek to compare the conquest of Indians and domination of Africans to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different modern ways of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity, one as historical and changeable, and the other as natural and permanent. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see identity as natural and thus a permanent claim is to see it as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. Let me begin with a discussion of American Indians and African Americans in the US. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian era in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the American Indian. What difference would it make if we were to call this museum the National Museum of the Native American and not the American Indian? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the 2 acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It's only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the US. The reservation was a creation of the United States. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, but it is a polity separate from the US. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What's the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the US. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are domestic dependent colonies. That's in quotes. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, in fact masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany, after Nuremberg, also embraced a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Nazi Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews after the Holocaust. The Nazi project may have been defeated militarily, but it survived politically. The two-state solution gave a longer lease to Nazism's political agenda. The latest version of the two-state solution is Israel-Palestine, in contrast to South Africa, where the native population was subordinated. Majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its boundaries, as had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals but not citizens. After that, Indians had to be naturalized. They had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could become US citizens. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different experiences in the modern era. Whereas their land was forcibly taken from the Indians, Africans were forcibly taken from the land. Indians were colonized. Africans were enslaved and dominated racially. The consequences have been radically different. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in thousands of separate plantation regimes. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes receding, the one-state framework made possible the development of alliances, making for a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on reservation Indians by forcing them to live in a separate political home, in effect a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Settlers studied the North American experience on how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, it was claimed that every homeland has from time immemorial been administered by a traditional authority, sanctioned by custom, and thus not subject to popular accountability. Finally, this traditional authority was said to have the right to enforce a customary law on the homeland. It was further claimed that custom had historical legitimacy since it has been there from time immemorial. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. First, that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Second, there can be a second and third class citizenship, as of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Indian citizens after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. This learning process has been documented in some detail by the historian James Q. Whitman of Yale in his book, Hitler's American Model. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. For Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond containing and taming national minorities to expunging the nation of all minorities and thus purifying it. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. Unlike the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, I focus on extreme violence as an outcome of collective mobilization against minorities in the nation state. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish its individual perpetrators, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies are mobilized. Rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived, victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. The alternative to a one-state solution is two states, one for perpetrators, the other for their victims. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all who survived that violence. Let me come to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. First, those who had never left. These were natives. Then, those who returned on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This was the first aliyah of immigrants. Finally, those who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. They came in the second and third aliyah. These were the settlers. Victims of the nation-state project in Germany and Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation-state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project has unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This was the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat, demanding that their numbers be further cut down. In reality, the Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined from Israel as a Jewish and democratic project to Israel as a Jewish state. I have already spelled out the significance of the debate on one state versus two-state solution. One state would be akin to direct racial domination, whereas a two-state solution would create a colonial protectorate. The history of the African slave in America shows that a one-state solution is a better framework for building alliances and broadening the frame and depth of resistance. But to have a future, that resistance needs to look for a third alternative. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid to glimpse this possibility. I argue that the anti-apartheid resistance took a creative turn in the 1970s, leading to an epistemological and political breakthrough for the anti-apartheid movement. Before the 70s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. It reproduced the architecture of apartheid, each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as African National Congress, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance, resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when black students, led by Biko, left the liberal white student organization, formed, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostel workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're black. There was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC, black consciousness, on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a black nation of the black majority, thus essentializing black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of black as a historical political identity, one that was constructed and thus could be changed. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition, but there was no consensus. The South African movement was born in the 70s and 80s. The anti-apartheid movement experienced a threefold shift in vision. From opposition, it looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than just turning the world upside down, it dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the black majority, it looked to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, it went on to oppose white power. The turning point was when anti-apartheid forces reformulated the demand from black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race, they refused to endow it with a political significance. The next step would be detribalization. Central to it would be to de-link culture from territory, ethnicity from homeland, citizenship from identity. To do so would be to reverse the politicization of culture under apartheid through the creation of homelands, homeland authority, and customary law. The result would be to create a single citizenship, not a hierarchy of multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state, and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created a formal political equality in South Africa, regardless of race. It is yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands, regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. 1994 was the birth of a new political community, instead of a rupture into two separate communities, one of victims and the other of perpetrators, blacks and whites, requiring a partition of South Africa. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners divided, with a minority asking for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The political community that did emerge in 1994 was that of survivors of apartheid, all survivors, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. Apartheid power was not defeated. Neither did it win. The situation in the mid-1980s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did captains of apartheid agree to negotiate in 1990? Two considerations made them rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One, the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from the townships to Bantustans. But more important was the likelihood of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon apartheid as a state project, looking for an alternative. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the political rebirth that did happen in 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning and not the end of decolonization. Now let me come to, finally, to Israel-Palestine. We need to begin by de-exceptionalizing Zionism. At the core of political Zionism is the effort to build not just a Jewish religious community in the whole land, but a Jewish state, a nation state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with the state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as it is the nation itself. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially recognized as a Jew. This is among the most fundamental of Israel's unanswered questions. If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question, who is a Jew? Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity, or both? As a result, the state of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by Halacha law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs. Halacha is religious law. And the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who embraced the role of civilizers committed to bringing other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are Arab Jews. Not only are they the majority among Jews in Israel, they also present a special challenge to Zionism. For Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile toward one another. Otherwise, there would be no need for a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. No wonder the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a religious Zionism that stands to the right of the Ashkenazim, politically sidelining it. For the Mizrahim, there are not one but two political enemies, not only Palestinians, but also Ashkenazi Israel. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. With must get out of the way and make room for the natives civilized by 500 years in the West. The Palestinian resistance has led to multiple shifts in the Palestinian liberation movement. From an early focus on armed struggle and following the First and Second Intifada, Palestinian mobilization in Israel and the occupied territories has moved to a demand for political change. The goal has been to undo the Jewish state and replace it with a state of all its citizens. Israel's political response has been to fragment Palestinians into three disconnected groups: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinian refugees. The development of a Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home, and from an all or nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, the Lebanon war was in fact a total war against the Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to the historian Rashid Khalidi. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. But while the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian resistance only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first intifada of the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it, a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going as far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories into a single movement. Both intifadas responded to the failings of the official PLO. The second, in particular, reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed it. The success of the second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, a political party then led by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. On May 21, 2001, Bishara proposed a new basic law aimed at achieving rights for Palestinians as a national minority. In the months that followed, Bishara presented another bill countering the false claim that Israel is a democratic state. He did so by asking the Knesset to rewrite that assertion in its basic law and instead affirm that Israel is, quote, a state of all its citizens. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset explicitly to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the State of Israel, there is reason to give it enthusiastic and full support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society, and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason to be critical. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on. That is, the South African divestment and boycott project during apartheid. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to win over forces that are either indifferent or opposed to the Zionist state to fragment its support base. What can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, the anti-apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Not only did the struggle include multiple initiatives, they were sometimes contradictory. Take the example of the anti-apartheid boycott, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle, which fought for the right of the oppressed majority to participate in the political process. Whereas the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both. The internal political struggle proceeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society, which did not openly and actively support the apartheid state. Second, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed will also lead to undermining the unity of their oppressors. When it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel. A consciousness based on the recognition that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, to repeat that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. This is also the lesson of Jewish life in New York City. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. I will invite Professor Hansen to begin his discussion. You will need to unmute yourself.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this and to give me the opportunity to read Mahmood's book. I'll say, just to begin with that, I was thrilled to do this because I knew that I would learn a lot, and I also and I come to this as both as someone who has, of course, done academic, but also work in South Africa and in India, but also have been engaged in the anti-apartheid movement from a very young age, actually, when I was in South Africa and in Southern Africa in 77, 78. So what I'm going to say is drawing to some extent from both of these registers. So thank you very much, Mahmood, for giving us this. I think it's a hell of a book. I really I compliment you on the kind of the number of interventions you make, and I particularly appreciate your providing a sort of a colonial genealogy of the nation state, which I think beginning in 1492, and showing us that America is and the American state is in fact the not just the first nation, but is also the first settler nation, as it were. So I think that's incredibly valuable, and there's so much in this book and so many examples, so I cannot do justice to all of it, of course. I think I want to say a few things to begin with that are kind of discussed perhaps a little bit less, and pose a few questions to Mahmood first on that front. And the first observation I have is really the status of the notion of sovereignty throughout Mahmood's book, especially popular sovereignty, because it's sort of also tethered both to questions of majority and minority, the sovereign and non-sovereign citizens, but at the same time, also to the question of self-determination, which Mahmood throughout is invoking as a form of political value, as something that is still part of our political imagination in a very fundamental sense. And so Mahmood's key critique of the nation state is that it locates sovereignty outside the political realm in history, in culture, customs, in race, in tribes, and these categories then became the basis for permanent majorities and permanent minorities. And it seems here that in the background, it's as if Mahmood is having some kind of conversation with Rousseau's social contract, that key mid-18th century text that defines the people as the fund and origin of all sovereignty. Now, in the social contract, the people is, interestingly, an open category. It is all those that assent to the contract and assent to being governed by the laws given by the legislators, who are not all elected by a simple majority, but that's a different story. But in this hugely influential text, the people is a political community, and Rousseau doesn't mention, interestingly, here, culture, language, race, or religion. He does that later on in other works, but much less so. And of course, many have remarked that in many ways Rousseau's notion of the political community is ultimately a rather provincial one, maybe drawn from the governance structures of the ideals of his native Geneva, for instance. But it's still interesting to think with this idea of a form of sovereignty that's based on the political community alone and not a pre-existing one. But as we know, popular sovereignty soon became entwined with nationalism and that construction of whiteness that really began in earnest in the 18th century as empires deepened across the world. We also know that the social contract in practice was undergirded by what Charles Mills has called the racial contract, that is the system of slavery and systemic subjugation of people of color that was the basis of the new states in the Atlantic sphere and indeed in Europe. And here, US was in this respect also a forerunner in explicitly being a republic for white people seeking self-determination based on a freedom tied to ownership and control of property, mostly land, but also people, slaves, and other productive assets. And it is interesting that to think of that it's or to incorporate in this that the entire justification throughout the 19th century of the expansion of the US was precisely the pursuit of self-determination, of sovereignty and freedom that was mobilized to justify all the exterminationist violence or subjugation. And to take, as Mahmood shows, I think very suggestively, to take the colonized people and the subjugated people into the ward of the state as political minors not yet ready for full nationhood, a model that Mahmood argues, I think persuasively, is then replicated across the world, across the colonial world. But I'm still puzzled by this question about sovereignty and self-determination, because if we accept those as values that on one hand has been systematically abused and twisted and constituted by colonial modernity, they're also central and indispensable to virtually every project of political and social emancipation. So the question is, how does one envisage another kind of political order that Mahmood is invoking, especially in the last chapter of the book, that's not anchored outside the political community of citizens, but within, and yet include the idea of political community as expressing a true and perhaps more inclusive popular community and more inclusive popular sovereignty. So I would like to hear Mahmood comment on this. And that leads me to a second general issue about what kind of politics or political modernity or political justice that's being invoked in this book. As I said, it's in some ways the idea of a political community that Mahmood refers to seems to be founded primarily by itself and for itself, and not in pre-existing cultural or social categories, as an open category that can accept all those that assent to its basic values, and perhaps can supersede, at times at least, class, race, ethnicity, and so on. And this seems to me to have echoes of classical republicanism, whether in the Arendtian sense or in some version of French republicanism, for instance. And as much as I in principle approve of Mahmood's critique of the nation state and its logic of permanent majorities and minorities, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what kind of political community and non-identitarian discourse that Mahmood maybe have in mind here. I'm reminded of the debates in the 1980s and 90s about what proper secularism should look like in India. Many in the room on the call will recall this. That is a form of politics that downplays religious passions and identities and rises somehow above those, such passions. And a very similar conversation about non-racial discourse also unfolding in the 90s in South Africa, a form of discourse that somehow could be both its own context and yet transcend the identity and position of the speaker or the agent. Now, does such a political life actually exist? And here is my second set of comments. Yes, Mahmood says it exists in what he calls the South African moment. And he holds that up as a model of a possible decolonized politics. Now, this is a political mobilization that began with the large strikes across South Africa in 1973 and morphed into the large cross-racial mobilization of students and workers. The most famous instance of this was, of course, the uprising in Soweto, but there was lots of other things going on. And it finally found a platform in the United Democratic Front in the 1980s that was led by clerics of Desmond Tutu famously, but also many others. And this is a moment that clearly not only brought the regime to its knees, maybe not militarily, but certainly morally, and that was showing that the future, there could be no future, a sustainable future, without a very large quantum of violence and repression going forward in South Africa. It was also, Mahmood argues, a moment that led to the historical compromise that paved the way for democracy in a post-racial society, at least in some respect. But my question is, can this moment, when we look at it a little more carefully, actually carry this weight as an example of a decolonized politics, and if so, how? Now, in the South African political vernacular, this is the story of what is called the civics. That is, civic organizations that were at the heart of this movement, a plethora of organizations that ran de facto many aspects of township life and other Black, Indian, and colored areas, especially Black areas, where the government was excluded from exercising anything but extremely project of making the townships ungovernable, as the slogan went in the 1980s, was effective, but the costs were also very considerable. Many of the civic structures were based in certain ethnic and tribal networks that provided forms of trust that were otherwise in short supply in the large township spaces that housed people from many groups and communities. Many civics were also involved in violent activities in the so-called self-defense units that wreaked a lot of violence on many areas. The 1980s saw a veritable civil war in many areas between the self-defense units loyal to the Black consciousness movement inspired by Steve Biko and those loyal to the ANC. The death toll was quite considerable. The ANC was abroad, but it also tried to operate and control lots of networks within the country. But the conflicts between the ANC and those loyal to the Black consciousness and the civics were divided between those camps did not begin with the return of Mbeki and the ANC elite in the 90s. They were pretty much defining the political struggle on the ground in the 1970s, especially the 1980s. Now, it's interesting that there is considerable nostalgia for this moment in South Africa, especially the 1980s today. But it's also equally interesting and puzzling, I feel, it's not the people you would expect that celebrate this moment. It's actually people like, for instance, Jacob Zuma and his infamous toxic masculinity, who would do this dance on stage and ask for his machine gun, alluding to a song that's called "Give Me My Machine Gun," alluding to the armed struggle, but also alluding to militancy of this age. It is people like Julius Malema, the leader of the economic freedom fighters, who are asking for vast economic reforms in the country and is opposed to the current political economic arrangement in South Africa. And their common currency is, and I would like to just say this from the point of view of what I was part of myself as a young person, that their common currency is precisely the dominant language that was the dominant language of the time, that was the ideological glue of much of the global anti-apartheid movement and on the ground. That is the outrage of white minority rule and the promotion of what seemed to us and many across the world as the most obvious political value in the world, that is ruled by the majority, by the Black majority. And finally, if I have time, Rosinka, do I have a few more minutes?
You can take a few more minutes. We're over time actually, but please wrap it up. Don't cut yourself off for that reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just So I just finally want to say a few words about what Mahmood considers legitimate political justice, political reform, and political violence, as opposed to the generalizing and moralizing language of moral culpability that's promoted by human rights discourse around the world. And I think there's something absolutely central to this critique that Mahmood is launching, but I also think that we maybe need to talk more about what would be then legitimate political reform and even legitimate political violence. In many ways, lots of people, including myself, would say that what the comrades engaged in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, including violent acts, could be considered legitimate political violence in opposition to an oppressive state, for sure. But it's complicated. Is the fight for self-determination always political in this way? Is it always decolonizing? Perhaps. Is a politics that seeks to evoke the people and a larger vision rising above the categories of community and tribe inherited from colonial regimes and the past? Is that legitimate? Perhaps. But it seems to me that there are questions about what constitutes what Mahmood is invoking as a more and more historically correct way of approaching many conflicts as political conflicts that needs to have a political solution. But what would that be? I will not go into the details here today about how to interpret this. For instance, what happens in India right now through this perspective, but I think it does demonstrate that there are considerable difficulties, or can be, in the way in which how we construct as political justice and what as an adequate political reform. Because it seems to me that the promise of the legal and the language of human rights is precisely that it rises above the political confrontation and the very disagreement that's at the heart of what is a political compromise, or what is even deemed legitimate or illegitimate. To deem something criminal is to determine that it's outside the norms of community and the political community. And can we even consider a political community that does not enforce its own norms, that does not declare something is outside or beyond the acceptable? And finally, I just want to point to one thing which I end with this little example, which is about the question of the survivor, as compared that Mahmood invokes both in his talk now, but also in various parts of the book, the value of the term survivor as compared to the victims and perpetrators. Now, the term survivor gets beyond the sort of polarity and the victim and the perpetrator, but it also could, and I think it has to some extent, it has the potential of, in some ways, naturalizing and even generalize the violence that everybody survived, like a storm. It can create a basis for a new community, but the ground must be prepared in some ways. And I see the South African case, and I want to stop there, as a case where you rightly point out that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's focus and work was way too narrow and way too focused on what was seen as the evil years of formal apartheid and not focused enough on the underlying structural and historical issues. But the result was also, and this is, I think, a political problem to this day, that there were very few people. There was not an equivalent of the denazification taking place in South Africa. There were very few people who lost their job, and there was only a gradual transformation of the national bureaucracy. And one of the big demographic changes was that many white people immigrated or quit the public sector and embraced often more lucrative careers in the private sector, so that white people in South Africa could be said to do better today after the transition to democracy than they did before. And so I think that raises some very fundamental questions about what we mean by justice and what we mean by political justice as opposed to a form of criminal justice. But I want to stop here and just thank Mahmood for forcing us and inviting us to think through all of these things in a way more complicated way than has often been the case in some of the previous literature. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hansen. I will quickly pass the metaphorical mic on to Bodhi. Dr. Bodhisattva, where are you, Bodhi? Are you?
I'm in Cape Town.
Are you here? Yes, there you are. No, yes, I mean virtually. Where are you? There you are. Yes. So go ahead.
Thank you. It is a hard act to follow Professor Mamdani and Professor Hansen, particularly because both of them clarified and sharpened some of the ideas I was struggling with. It is an absolute pleasure, of course, to be here and to be able to listen to all of you. The breathtaking scope of Neither Settler Nor Name is only matched by its incredible clarity of thought and its inexhaustible erudition. It is ambitious, it is provocative, and it is a page-turner. Like all books by Professor Mahmood Mamdani, I've learned a great deal from this one, and I'm sure that I will continue to do so, as I see no escape from coming back to this book at different points in the future with different sets of questions. Therefore, the kind of issues I want to raise in discussion today is very preliminary, very rough, and based entirely on the excitement and bewilderment of a first reading. I must also make it clear at the beginning that I'm persuaded by many of the arguments in the book and that I'm in sympathy with most of his objectives. So, of course, I'm not going to summarize the layered arguments of this 400-page book. Rather, I want to point at three particular zones of argument, as it were, which are making me think. The first one is the question of models, of templates, of designs, of prototypes. Professor Mamdani, in fact, uses all these terms, some more than the others, of course, to designate a particular style of relationship between the first occurrence of a specific configuration and the subsequent recurrence or variations of that configuration. It is in this sense that he can write that the quote-unquote Indian reserves of the United States, starting in 1763, have come to function as prototypes for the early 20th century South African native reserves, or the Nazi concentration camps of the 30s and 40s. Or the Nuremberg trial has become a model for organizing justice in post-Second World War states by depoliticizing extreme violence. Now, this is an extremely helpful narrative device. Without isolating these configurations as paradigmatic, we will be lost in jungles of half-resonant descriptions, and Professor Mamdani will not be able to take us trotting across the globe over 5 centuries. but it comes with an analytical cost. Configurations become models or prototypes only through repetitions. And Professor Mamdani understandably seizes on the moments of conscious imitations, studied replications, like the early 1930s Nazi lawyers studying the United States legal structure of miscegenation and race-based immigration. From my own research, I can add examples from the Indian context, how Ambedkar was explicitly drawing on the US Indian Reserve's laws to draft the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution that provided for the administration of tribal areas in the Indian Northeast. But I'm sure that Professor Mamdani would not insist on taking these specific strings of examples as the only possible genealogy of the world order of the nation states. Rather, this, I believe, is intended as a strategic genealogy, much in the Spivakian fashion of strategic ascent, which alerts us to a largely overlooked pattern that can help us to relativize the sovereignty of nationally bounded events. The real question here is that exemplarity. What constitutes the force of the example? How can a configuration or an arrangement born in a here and now exert a cogency there and then? Ever since we stopped considering the possibility of a cosmic order or a natural law, the normativity of examples has been established in different disciplines through different methods. In law, it has been structured around the notion of conformity with precedents. In the mainstream history of ideas, the emphasis has long been on who read whom, influence and impact. Social histories, in their turn, have focused on institutions and mentalities. I am not sure what moves the models in Professor Mamdani's account. What is transportable for whom under what conditions? Are we talking about a bundle of small techniques often developed independently by different actors at different points of time and place and consciously coordinated on a planetary scale only in the 20th century? Or are we talking about an Ur model that governed all imperial imaginations post-1492? What was inevitable in this reproduction? What was adaptable? What was non-negotiable? Were states more equipped to reproduce success than non-states? To the last question, at least, I think Professor Mamdani provides an answer as he flags the value of what he calls post-apartheid South Africa's political model, that he opposes to Nuremberg's criminal model. This is a rare segment of the argument by which I'm not readily persuaded. I do not want to minimize the several criticisms of the South African transition process that Professor Mamdani himself notes in the book. He shows how and why the TRC is but another variation on the Nuremberg model. He shows how the recognition and in some cases embellishment of the so-called traditional authorities has reinforced the colonial logic of the tribes and so on. And yet on the whole, his emphasis is on the 1991-92 moment of CODESA and its acceptance of non-racial democracy as the normative horizon for post-apartheid South Africa. This, he argues, is the lesson to take home. Not victims' justice, but survivors' justice. And the faith that Professor Mamdani places in the category of survivors is my second point of wonderment. He's certainly not interested in a critical genealogy of this category here, which for me was a little surprising, given the long shadow of Nuremberg undeniably nourishing its development and elaboration in the 1960s trauma theory of Henry Christel and William Nederland, most prominently, of course, but also subsequently of Paul Chodov and Gunther Winkler and others. Professor Mamdani, the category of survivor, instead, is aimed at the broadest degree of inclusion. Victims, perpetrators, bystanders, beneficiaries, exiles, everyone is a potential survivor, except the dead. This almost creates a Lockean blank slate. It emphasizes the shared fact of survival, even at the cost of suspending or invisibilizing the difference in terms of consequences and culpability. It is ironic, because the whole project is built on the promise of moving beyond the limits of the Lockean logic of toleration. And yet, upon finishing this majestic masterpiece, I was left wondering whether this invocation of a degree zero of survival functions as a new state of nature, on which henceforth all counts of majority-minority would be contingent and therefore will be political, not natural, a logic that is not anterior to or prior to the process of democratization, but that is assembled and reconfigured through the volatility of democratic politics. I hesitate to say that because, as I said, Professor Mamdani would be among the first to point out that this logic, like all lofty logics of Bandung and Havana, was immediately undercut and interrupted in South Africa by the logics and claims of pre-existing identities. The Constitution of South Africa bears as much the imprint of customary law as that of non-racial democracy. Why do we then autonomize and highlight the normative potential in what can arguably be also read as a statement of compromise in the course of a passive revolution? I am an incorrigible optimist, given to privileging the future over the past, Professor Mamdani discloses. But I am not a romantic, he reminds us. I embrace the Foucauldian insight, but not the closure it points to, end of quote. This impossible embrace has marked the best strand of post-colonial thought since Edward Said. So no, I'm not surprised at this. But this indeed is my third and final question or puzzlement. Is the dream of decoupling the state from the nation, the hope of separating justice from revenge, the promise of distinguishing democracy from neoliberal human rights remedies, bound to fall back ultimately on a classical liberal model where war can be transformed into politics, enemies into adversaries, violence into externalities? Replacing the nation state with the mayor state, a legal sovereign with equal treatment of citizens, Professor Mamdani writes in his concluding chapter, does not mean there is no more diversity in the world. It means that diversity is no longer politicized, end of quote. I'm not going to invoke a cynical pragmatism against this self-consciously utopian proposition, but I do wonder whether the figure of a post-political diversity excites all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bodhi. Thank you for that. Karthik, are you there? If you could come on now.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Karthik Manoharan.
Hello, can you see me?
Hi, hi Karthik. Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much, Rosenkadi, for inviting me as a book discussant for this really amazing and remarkable and might I add, courageous work. So, as a scholar who has engaged very deeply with the works of Frantz Fanon and grappled myself with certain issues regarding decolonization and the discourses around decolonization in the university today, let me start by saying that I'm going to approach Professor Mamdani's work from this perspective. So let me again say that this book was an eye-opener to me at several levels, and it was a good read from the start till the end. So without further ado, let me just jump into it. But let me start with some concerns which I have regarding the manner in which decolonization is popularly addressed today. So in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, Jesus Christ returns only to be persecuted by a Christian inquisition that he does not recognize, and one that does not need him for its own version of Christianity, right? So I wonder if some of the most passionate advocates of colonization from the previous century, like Frantz Fanon or Amilcar Cabral, might somehow be resurrected. I fear that they might meet a similar fate should they return to witness contemporary debates on decolonization. We might observe that often the loudest votaries of decolonization today are largely located in the West, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries and especially in the universities, right? there are calls for decolonizations at several spheres. There's decolonize the public space, calls to decolonize philosophy, decolonize the curriculum, decolonize music, decolonize museums, decolonize food. There's even a call to decolonize sex. Right? Now, in a very sort of a crude and perhaps even reductive summation of the immediate actions that such a decolonist desire seems to be remove statues that make us uncomfortable, remove curriculum that makes us uncomfortable, right? Far from decolonization being a radical political act conceived by thinkers like Fanon and Cabral, the imagination of new forms of doing politics and creating human communities that these thinkers wrote about, the decolonization popularly discussed in Western universities today, popularly, I would like to add, discussed in Western universities today appears to be a sort of a fallout of the official dogmas of multiculturalism, often used as a euphemism for diversity and inclusion, a trendy catchphrase, not more, which is very much embedded in the cultural logic of neoliberal capital. I think, I sense that in these sort of popular debates on decolonization, there is a shift from an emphasis on political action to cultural dialogues on inclusion and diversity within European universities. Now, just as the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky claims that the rule of God can be established only through the devil's principles, can we also say provocatively that what passes off as decolonization in the West is but an attempt to celebrate the identities of non-Western minorities, but within purely Western principles? Professor Mamdani's intervention in Neither Settler Nor Native, I believe, gives the teeth back to decolonization by viewing it as a fundamental act of politics. I differentiate Professor Mamdani's remarkable work as decolonization as politics, and I think it is totally different from the commonsensical discussions on decolonization as culture. To Professor Mamdani, decolonization and decolonizing the political is the unmasking and unsettling of permanence of identities that have been ascribed a majority and a minority status within the contours of the nation state. What Professor Mamdani is proposing in the book is nothing less than a thorough reimagination of the category of the nation state, what it claims to encompass, and what claims to encompass. Professor Mamdani provides 3 suggestions to decolonize the political, namely, to base citizenship on the basis of residence rather than identity, to denationalize the states through the formation of federal structures, and finally, a sort of an education about the nature of the nation state to weaken nationalist discourse. People who are living in sort of right-wing populist regimes and who are encountering right-wing populist regimes cannot stress the importance that these suggestions have in the contemporary world today. But we can also see traces of Fanon over here, given that Fanon had also advocated for a switch from national consciousness to a social and political consciousness once the colonizer was ejected. Professor Mamdani is prescribing something more than that over here. While it is definitely helpful to read Professor Mamdani in the tradition of the political decolonists of the past, such as Frantz Fanon and Cabral, his work also underscores, Neither Settler Nor Native also underscores the limitations of the discourse of the political decolonists of the previous century. Frantz Fanon, for instance, as I said above, he clearly privileges a social consciousness over a national consciousness. And he also wanted to base his idea of citizenship on shared political solidarities rather than fixed notions of identity or nationality. Fanon was also sharply critical of the racial essentialism of the negritude movement, and I believe this is something which is not underscored or highlighted by several scholars engaging with Fanon today. The sharp criticisms he had on the sort of identitarianism which negritude prescribed. However, as far as decolonization as such was concerned, Fanon also saw the nation as a sort of a phase through which you all had to pass through before you could arrive at a sort of an international consciousness. Likewise, in an associated sense, Fanon also saw the tribe as a primordial identity that had to be superseded by the nation, which would later be superseded by humanity. In Professor Mamdani's chapter on Sudan, we can realize what this sort of an imagination could have, what disastrous consequences this sort of an imagination could have. However, Fanon's flawed dialectical conception of the tribe being superseded by nation and the nation being superseded by humanity, which he expressed with stunning clarity in The Wretched of the Earth, made for powerful prose, but also risks falling prey into virulent nationalist rhetoric in newly independent former colonies. So in that sense, where I feel it is necessary to, even if we are critical of him, to agree with Homi Bhabha that perhaps it is better or more suitable for us to retrieve black skin, white masks now rather than The Wretched of the Earth. And likewise, I also feel that reading neither settler nor native gives an important correction to certain omissions and certain extravagances which Fanon makes in The Wretched of the Earth. Now, Fanon also wrote about Algeria's European minority in A Dying Colonialism, where he calls for an integration of Europeans and Jews in Algeria into the liberation struggle based on an ethic of solidarity, eschewing any form of resentful ethnic or religious hatred. However, reality as we know in Algeria was quite different. The Algerian National Front, of which Fanon was a spokesperson, massacred hundreds of French civilians. They had traces of anti-Semitism. And this was, of course, definitely in response to colonialist violence that killed thousands of Arabs. Fanon, nevertheless, despite being a spokesperson, believed in the possibility of a political commitment to a common cause, trumping ethnic affiliations. However, the one-party state led by the FLN also forced leading Algerian leaders like the leftist Ahmed Messali Haj into exile, and they murdered supporters of rival factions and also tribal leaders. And we all know that the civil war which followed in independent Algeria killed more people than colonialism itself. But we can also realize that it was the colonialist structures that laid the seeds of this sort of fratricidal hatred and divisions within Algerian society. Right? This is a particular very strong lesson which I take from Professor Mamdani's work, that these sort of forms of tribalism, there was nothing natural about them. These were created during a particular phase, the colonialist phase in history, and there is also a possibility for transcending it through a sort of a common political action, which would be the true act or the true political act of decolonization. Which is likewise why I also agree with him that the simple binary of victim and perpetrator that is parroted by the global human rights industry leaves probably more problems than solution. Having said that, however, I would like to question if we could arrive at a sort of a global, international, or even a universalist mechanism, which can replace or which can be an alternative to the existing human rights industry that simply things in terms of victims and perpetrators. So I would just like to end with a few more points about the book. I found the treatment of the Indians, the American Indians, I find it very significant that he doesn't use the term Native Americans. So if they are Native Americans, so the rest are cultural Americans or what? Anyway, so I find the very empathetic treatment of the Indians and the sort of crucial problems that they faced. I mean, I'm familiar with the fact that the Indians had undergone a genocide and they survived the genocide over there. But to the extent to which this was imposed by the settlers and by American law is just mind-blowing, completely mind-blowing. And I also would like to wonder, because Professor Mamdani clearly says that in the current American context, in fact, for the past several decades, it has been a lot easier to speak about race and the discrimination that the blacks face. And usually there is a sort of a culture of silence among the activities of the settlers that led to the institutional marginalization and erasure of the Indians on their own land. I just wonder if this is the same case in India, where also it is easier, much easier to talk about discrimination on the basis of caste or religion than on the rights of the indigenous communities in India and the sort of expropriation of them from their land and their resources, which has been a permanent feature since the formation of the Indian nation state. Likewise, I would also like to add a point that Professor Mamdani's chapter on denazification is probably the most powerful statement on the aftermath of the Third Reich after Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. Now, I'm just wondering if we could extend this analysis to elsewhere, let's say to Japan, for instance, where the nation-state formation, which happened during the Meiji Restoration, which was definitely influenced by modernization based on Western principles, but it also had a very sort of a uniquely Japanese flavor to it. Without being aware of what the Americans did to the Indians, or perhaps what even the Ottomans did to the Armenians, Japanese nationalism, which grew as an outcome of the Meiji Restoration, was strongly militaristic and xenophobic in its character. And the first people to face its brunt were the Korean minorities in Japan. I wonder if this sort of a expulsion or this sort of a disassociation, deliberate dissociation of minorities from the national body politic is a sort of a permanent condition of modernity as such. And whether we should look at decolonization as not just an indictment of coloniality, but perhaps of the rise of modernity per se. And finally, there's just a doubt which I have about how Professor Mamdani opens his book with the Reconquista, right? From what little I've read about the Reconquista, which happened in Spain, I didn't get the essence that the Reconquista was essentially let's say a nation state in formation, right? It appeared more as though a sort of a religious struggle which existed between the Spanish Christians and the Moors and the Jews, similar to what happened in Jerusalem in the preceding times when the Christian crusaders were ejected by the Islamic forces, right? Likewise, we might also want to think that at this point of time, Christian Spain was a cultural and economic backwater, while the Islamic Empire was the first world during that period. So, in a sense, the Spanish Christians, what they were rejecting was not a vulnerable or a sort of a marginalized community, but a people whom they saw as conquerors of their own land. In some sense, I feel a more apt contemporary analogy would be between the Taliban of today and the Spanish Christians of those days, right? You know, there are people from a cultural and economic backwater standing up to, you know, much technologically and potent culturally, you know, superior force. I'm just wondering, these are just general questions, but thank you again for giving me the opportunity to read this amazing work, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karthik. Professor Mamdani, should we, because we've sort of run quite considerably over time, should we open it up to the audience, and would you be a little more patient and just take a few questions from the audience and then address whichever questions you feel like answering altogether, or do you want to go, do you want to reply to these comments first? How would you like to do it?
Look, I'm happy to do as you want me to do. Of course, my preference would be to respond to what I've heard, because it's a feast. And now, before the feast gets even bigger, where the response will be difficult, because I will not be able to avoid the impression that I am ignoring many of the issues which have been raised, and speculation as to why I am ignoring them. So, but you decide. I mean, even if I respond now, I will not be responding to everything.
So go ahead then. Go ahead then. Respond to whatever it is that you want to respond to among these three discussants, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let me first say that I really even though I'm an incorrigible optimist, I am not trying to draw the sort of outlines of a future. I am not, I do not believe that it's the job of the intellectual to do so. I do not believe that intellectual blueprints, the intellectual imagination by itself, can go without or without a reflection on the existing moment. And by the existing moment, I mean social movements, political movements, which try and work out different ways forward. I think that these movements provide the intellectual with raw material on which to theorize. I think that the raw material is necessarily inconsistent, but the intellectual cannot invent the world afresh. Now, although this is one of the comments being made by my discussants, am I trying to? Do I think I want to create a Lockean tabula rasa, and you know, or what am I doing? How is it different from Locke? So that's one sort of preliminary point I want to make. Second point I want to make is liberalism. To my knowledge, in my understanding, liberalism in its embrace of individual rights, individual autonomy, and its allergy to group identities. There is only one group identity that liberalism is not allergic to. There's only one group identity that liberalism takes as a natural phenomenon. And that group identity is the nation. which I believe is at the heart of a liberal notion of the state, liberal political modernity. And so I agree completely with the last commentator that this book should not just be read as a book about colonialism. It's a book about the nation state, and about. So the larger canvas is the nation state, not just the colonial state. Although many of the case studies and much of the discussion is about colonial modernity. Am I trying to, again, a lot of questions about liberalism, about Hannah Arendt. I really don't think that Hannah Arendt broke from the nation state imagination. She had a critique from it, but she didn't really draw the conclusions. Hannah Arendt was even not comfortable with the binational state. Hannah Arendt had great anxieties about the creation of a state where Jews would be a minority. But so much so that in her writings on the Jewish question, she often begins to write as if Jews are a majority in Palestine. So Hannah Arendt is never able to come to grips with the minority question and the question of permanent minorities. Do I think that we can ignore pre-existing foundations? Am I trying to say, this is back to the Lockean question and tabula rasa. What do I mean by survivors? So I'm really not talking of all violence. I'm not, and I will come to this question, I'm not talking of all violence. I'm talking of extreme violence. I'm talking of civil war. And I'm talking of, there are two possibilities after the civil war. One possibility is partition, is two states, and the other possibility is one state. The two states, in most cases, one claims to be a state of the perpetrator and the other a state of the survivor. Survivor's justice, in my view, has always required victory, which is why survivor's justice is a masks victor's justice. And it's victor's justice that I think is the real problem. It's very interesting. I mean, even before going to other cases, I would suggest we think of the American Civil War and we think of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln is trying to think of a political community after the Civil War. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a very, very small, short document, is really about the need to be born again, not in religious terms, but the need to be born again. Although I'm not a Lincolnian, I mean, Lincoln had his other side, which is the reservation. But the need to be born again. And you can create a new political community, but that doesn't mean that you create a tabula rasa. It does not mean that you leave behind the entire history of social, cultural, and even political, or particularly political, we may say, conflicts and struggles. Let's take the South African moment to discuss this. The violence of the 1980s, the civil wars between Black consciousness and the African National Congress. There are many interpretations of this. Was it a war between the internal and the external wings of the South African liberation struggle? We know, I mean, I spoke about this, that the liberation struggle was broad, and there was quite often disagreement between the internal and the external wing. I don't want to go into those issues again, but it is not a surprise that the South African state chose to dialogue with the ANC in exile, and I might add the ANC in prison, but not with the internal wing of the, not with those who were born of the 70s and 80s. Again, I mean, Zuma, Malema, the glorification of armed struggle. In the book, I really suggest that the armed struggle was failed. The armed struggle actually, what the armed struggle did was to take those who were leading internal resistance out into exile, so as to train them and return them. And this left the communities inside South Africa more or less demobilized and defenseless. So that the period of armed struggle, the decade of armed struggle between Sharpeville and the 1973 Durban strikes, was the decade of massive foreign investment. The second most important decade of economic growth in South Africa. One more thing about the South African moment, which I think, so in 1994, and this will help me explain my views a little more. In 1994, in the first post-apartheid election, one of the big issues was who should vote, the citizen or the resident, okay? The citizen was the Rousseauian moment, okay? Because Rousseau's popular sovereignty, its parameters are the nation. And the individual who belongs to the nation is the citizen. Now in South Africa, residents were in the millions. Migrant workers from Mozambique, from Rhodesia, from Lesotho, from Malawi, from many places. They had been at the heart of the unionization of the 1970s and the formation of FOSATU. They became not marginal, but they were not as important when we come a decade later to COSATU, but they're very important. And it's a sign of their importance that the decision, final decision out of this contest, citizen or resident, was that the resident should have the right to vote, not just the citizen. It enfranchised the migrants alongside those whose descent was inside South Africa. In 1994, Gatsha Buthele's, in 1994, Inkatha Freedom Party in the dispensation got the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and Gatsha Buthelezi became the Minister of Internal Affairs. From then on, from 1994, Gatsha Buthelezi went on to systematically chip away at the political rights of migrants, to chip away at what had been at the dispensation they had gotten in 1994. Also, the Inkatha Freedom Party launched a massive campaign about how migrants were really feasting, were sowing, were reaping where they had not sowed. That the South African struggle had been a citizen struggle, and migrants were taking advantage of it. It's not a surprise that the xenophobic violence began in the 1990s. It's also not a surprise that the xenophobic violence was not against the racial stranger. It was against the tribal stranger. It was against the African across the border. So I think this should give us a lot of food for thought. Finally, criminal justice, and I don't talk of political justice. I did talk of political justice in my earlier articles, but in writing this book, I dropped the notion of political justice because I realized that criminal justice takes place within the parameters of a political community, and that I was really talking of reinventing the political community, rethinking the political community. And not that I was dispensing with criminal justice, but I was very aware of the limitations of criminal justice. Two major limitations. Criminal justice individualizes the notion of violence, exactly like Nuremberg, where the contribution of Nuremberg is supposed to be that it ascribed a responsibility to the individual, including the state agent. But more important about criminal justice is that crime cannot be against the state, the state cannot commit crime. Crime can only be against the state. Now, where the violence is driven, it's a state-driven violence and not just a violence driven from below. We usually have a combination of the two, but it's critical. The role of the state is critical here. It's not surprising that the TRC had nothing to say about state-driven violence, only about violence driven by agents of the state. Well, I think in situations where we're talking of founding a new political community, the major problem is violence driven by the state. Rosinka, I'll stop here. There are many other issues, but I realize that I haven't done justice to everybody, but
yes, it's going to come on to almost 2 hours now. So you must be sort of, you know, I'm not sure whether you're getting tired, but it is getting closer to dinner time over here. But we have to open this up to the audience a little bit. I would like to ask anybody who might have a question to please put their questions briefly to Professor Mamdani. Is there anybody who would like to? There's no need to raise hand or, you know, go through all the technical rigmarole. You can just unmute yourselves and perhaps also come on to the video so that we can see whoever is asking the question. And
Hi, Professor. Hi.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anandarup Sen. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. Good afternoon, Professor Mamdani. Thank you for the discussion, and thank you, the discussants, for a very insightful conversation. I have a very short question, which kind of takes off from where Professor Mamdani left us. Though he doesn't necessarily talk about the forms of violence in contemporary Africa or independent Africa, specifically, but there is a lot one can take from that. I was wondering how non-state violence actually features in his imagination of this political community. Because more and more, and I'm thinking through Achille Mbembe's work and James Ferguson's work, more and more, especially in terms of resource-rich African nations, as he works through Zambia and Angola, and in South Africa through private security systems like executive outcomes, a lot of the violence is actually more and more privatized. So it's not so much, I wouldn't say it's not so much, but the private corporate entities which are actually major players in controlling and managing violence. So how does that particular phenomenon actually relate to, or does it actually speak to the conversation that Professor Mamdani has kind of outlined for us in this book and throughout his work? And this book is a culmination of his larger work as I see it. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Moidul, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mahmood, for a fascinating book. I have been reading this in the last few weeks. Now, thanks to this whole entire LibGen thing, everything is now free. And thanks to all the discussants, all three discussants were fantastic, wonderful. My question is largely at the conceptual level. One is that if we read three books of you together, Citizen, Subject, Define and Rule, and this book, then
I'm sorry, Moidul,
what
could you just repeat that, because the screen froze for a little while, for me at least. I'm not sure whether for others as well,
no,
but just go back a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying that if we read Mahmood's Citizen, Subject, Define and Rule, and this book, then what he is doing is fascinating in terms of dealing with categories. And in this book, of course, the category of minority is very much, and he argues that it is the colonial moment and the which creates a condition where the categories are being actually held up, which is the citizen subject. So colonialism is something which is an interventionist kind of agency. Now, in terms of unpacking the nation and state, I find the missing concept of capital in this book. So 500 years of the modern nation state, and what he wants to kind of dissociate nation and the state. I think there is a lot of history of capital also, which is somewhat missing in this book. So if he can, of course, one cannot address all fundamental concepts in one kind of one book. So I'm quite surprised to see that, given Mahmood's earlier association with Marxism, why capital is very much missing in this book. The nation and state is very much there, and so.
Okay, with that brief and very large question, is there anyone else, or should we just allow Professor Mamdani to take these two questions? And then, is there anyone else who wants to ask a question?
Am I audible?
Yes, Darshan, go ahead.
I'm sorry, this is Shukarna. I'm sorry, I have to operate out my son's school account. Sorry about that. Also, sorry for not being able to put on the video because I'm working from my phone. Anyway, but to cut that short,
go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you all for that great discussion. It was very enthralling. I had a very brief question. I have not yet been able to read the book, so please do excuse me if it's misplaced in some senses. I'm thinking about the category of the survivor, which which is very interesting to think about. And I'm wondering whether we should also be able to think about perpetrators as survivors. Sorry, did that come across?
I got till perpetrators as survivors.
Yes, that's my question. Should we also think of perpetrators as survivors?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is that all, or is there anybody else? Okay, Professor Mamdani, go ahead and take these three questions.
Thank you very much. To Anandrup Sen, I am skeptical whether one should consider executive outcomes or the plethora of security companies spreading throughout the African continent. The spread really coming sort of in the post-apartheid period, and very much connected with the apartheid state apparatus, whose operatives and institutions, many of its institutions, survived the end of legal apartheid. I'm skeptical that these can be considered private. They are more like parastatal. They occupy that zone between the state and society. These are either they are like executive outcomes. They are set up by former apartheid operatives. They have they can only operate under the license, if not the consent of the state. In fact, not only the state, but most of these security companies, I know from the Ugandan experience, provide, I mean, they don't just provide local security for the local rich or create walled communities, but they also provide security operatives for the Americans in Iraq, in different places. They train dogs. They send everything from security to domestic workers to everything. But this is, maybe you should think of them as kind of NGOs, not the civics that Hansen was talking about, but there's a fascinating story in South Africa of how civics became NGOs and the NGO connection with donors, etc. But these are connected directly to the state, both locally and internationally.
Thank you for that.
Often, you know, the Rwandan genocide is often thought of as the most sort of non-state kind of violence. But even in the Rwandan genocide, the role of the state was critical. Even though maybe over a million, when I did the interviews in Rwanda, the common view among Tutsis was that a million plus Hutus were involved in that genocide. Moidul, why am I not talking of capital, especially given my Marxist background? I wouldn't call it background. I mean, you know, I have not discarded Marxism. I see Marxism as a very important part of my learning process, but part of that learning process was kind of an understanding of what I found wanting in the Marxism that I read. And what I found wanting in the Marxism that I read was precisely the political. And which is why this book is focused so much on the political. When writing this book, I was very aware that this was a legacy of liberalism that Marxism had embraced. Marxism had almost naturalized the phenomenon of the nation state. Marx and Engels distinguish between what they call historical nations and non-historical nations. And historical nations for them were nations which got to found their own state. And non-historical nations did not get to found their own states and became minorities in other states. Shukarna, please don't mind if I address you by your first name, because I don't have the last name in my head. But yes, I do mean I do see perpetrator as part of survivor. In notions of criminal justice, the perpetrator is usually disenfranchised politically, and I do not see what kind of a post-Civil War future one would have is if perpetrators were disenfranchised politically. And perpetrators are not just on one side. One thing about civil war is that victims and perpetrators is that first of all that the violence is, we have cycles of violence, and victims and perpetrators often trade sides. You can see this in Rwanda very, very clearly. The kind of mass violence against Hutu population, understood by the state as perpetrators in the previous cycle of violence, has resulted in massive killings. So I am thinking very much of the challenge is how to found a new political community which includes all sides in the civil war. That's the challenge as I see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. I will now for one last time ask the audience if anybody has a very pressing question that they feel they absolutely must ask. Today I can see a lot of familiar names here, but I will not press anybody unless they want to come forward themselves. So is there anybody else, or should we call this session to a close and let Professor Mamdani off the hook, or let ourselves off the hook, actually? Right. Okay. So I'll take it that there are no further questions. Thank you very much for making the time. I know that you have been very busy doing a lot of these book discussions ever since the book came out, and you've perforce had to do them online rather than face to face, which can be actually more strenuous and go on for longer, without the advantage of any cheese and wine afterward, or or chai and biscuit, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for acceding to our request to participate in this, for graciously making the time, for speaking. I wasn't sure whether you would actually take the time to do that, but you did. And then for this very involved and interesting discussion, I think the three discussants we had today came at you from various angles and opened up prisms that were all in themselves rewarding to engage with and deal with. Thank you for your responses to them, and we hope to see you soon, and maybe when the next book is out, because the books will keep coming, we hope. So thank you, Professor Mamdani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaudhary, and thank you to the discussants. Thank you to the participants.
So thank you, everybody. With that, I'll end the meeting with a virtual wave. Here, it's always very abrupt, the signing off, but here we go. So bye-bye, and thank you for being here. And thank you also very much to our discussants for the work they put in and for their involved responses. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Mamdani, can I ask something just quickly? Is it true that you are now going back to Idi Amin to write a new book on Amin? That's what I heard through the grapevine. So
the grapevine usually is correct.
Okay, looking forward to that. Thank you.
Never doubt your access to the grapevine, Bodhi. And you're very lucky because my cursor was on end meeting for all.
No, sorry, I don't want to punish anybody. I was just very curious because I was remembering the old book on Uganda, and I was thinking like what it would mean in terms of, and then someone told me that you are actually planning to write now again on Idi Amin. So looking forward. Thank you so much for this wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. So I will now end the meeting.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pravin. Good to see you.
Yes, good to see you too.
Yes.
Hey, Pravin, how are you?
I joined very late, so I couldn't take part in the discussion. But I look forward to seeing the thing on YouTube, hopefully. So I hope you will publicize the recording.
No, what I will do is I will send you the recording that we record. We don't actually have a YouTube system up in place yet. Yes, we are technologically slightly handicapped still.
No, but I would appreciate that very much if you could let me.
But it has been recorded, so I can just send you the file. I can arrange to do that.
Lovely. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yep.
And thanks, Mahmood. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Pravin.
Take care.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.